Thanks for listening to this podcast of Trending with Timmerie. If you haven't already subscribed, please catch us wherever you love to listen to your podcast, from the relevant radio app to Apple, YouTube, you name it, we are there. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to go and give us a 5-star review to help other people discover the podcast. Anything you share in terms of episodes, whether it's texting it to a friend, posting on social media, helps to build up the kingdom for God, to help confront the challenging issues we face as a culture, but with joy, with hope, and with an eternal perspective where our faith collides with everyday life, bringing eternal principles to help us live our life joyfully.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
It's Gentleman's Hour today on Trending. That means, any question goes. Questions that you'd otherwise maybe not quite ask your mom or sister. You can ask me. I'd love to hear from you. The number's 1-888-914-9149. What do men fear? Indiana Jones was terrified of snakes. Many men fear failure and inadequacy. Love to hear from you. You can comment now on my Instagram story sharing what you or other men you know may fear. And yes, we'll play that game today if you don't feel like sharing what you fear. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie during our weekly marriage hour. We're also going to discuss indulging in alcohol as a gentleman. Fascinating conversation here. But before we go there, I am very excited. I've admired this man's work for many years now, and I'm excited to dive into a conversation. Dr. Leonard Sax is the author of countless books, from Boys Adrift, Why Gender Matters, Girls on the Edge, including parenting books as well. He's both an MD and a PhD in psychology, so he's a practicing medical doctor, family practice, as well as especially a researcher in the area of psychology. And really, he is at the forefront of addressing the crisis today of what is feminine and what is masculine, and how to help our boys and girls, and let's be real, adult men and women, in understanding and coming into the fullness of our identity. I'd like to dive into the topic of why young men are struggling so much in underperforming, and why this is also impacting our boys. In his work, Boys Adrift, he identifies 5 key areas which we're going to walk through and really dive into solutions. Maybe this is your son, whether college age or perhaps a child who's been prescribed medication for ADHD and you don't think your kid has ADHD. We're going to talk about this today on Trending. So you can find him at leonardsax.com. That's leonardsax.com. We'll include links in the show notes today. Welcome, Dr. Sax, to Trending.
Thanks for inviting me.
Let's talk about how you first came upon the widespread crisis today of Boys Adrift.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm a family doctor, and really goes back 30 years. Back in the early 90s, I had set up a practice in Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., and I started seeing all these families where the girl's doing well, she's doing well in school, she's doing all these activities, and her brother is a goofball who is not living up to his potential. And my first thought, as I saw more and more in these families in my own practice, was what is wrong with suburban Maryland? Because this was not my experience growing up in Ohio back in the 70s. I graduated from public high school in 1977, and I remember the honors ceremony, the kids who were getting all kinds of awards at graduation. It was all boys. The award for poetry went to a boy. The editor of the school newspaper was a boy. The valedictorian was a boy. There were very few. I don't remember any girls on the stage, actually. Mm-hmm. And my high school still has those honor ceremony. Now it's all girls. Anyhow, reaching out to colleagues, I learned that this was not unique to suburban Maryland, that this was happening across the United States. And it took me about 10 years of research to try to figure out what's going on, what's driving this. And that led to my book, Boys Adrift, the first edition published in 2007. But then a lot of things have changed since then, so the publisher invited me to write a second edition, which came out more recently.
I love it. Fantastic book. 10 out of 10 recommend. Boys Adrift. We'll include a link in the podcast notes today as well. Lucas, if you can post that on social media, let's get a link out there for people to check out. It's a real resource to many parents who are wondering what's going on with my kid. Let's talk a little bit about how you came across this as well in Calgary in your work.
So that was a conversation I had with parents about what they were observing, and back when we were trying to figure out the reasons, and people would throw out reasons like, maybe boys are being poisoned by the environment, maybe it's a left-wing conspiracy, and when I entered this topic, I really didn't know. I hadn't done the research, and I thought a big part of it would be that boys today are more likely to be raised by single moms than was the case 30 years ago.
Right.
So I was really surprised by what I found.
Parents just saying, this is a challenge today with my kids across the board. Okay, let's dive into more of kind of those 5 key leading areas of underperformance in males that you've really grown to identify and see this is what's going on, and you provide many solutions. So let's do an overview if you wouldn't mind, and then we'll narrow in on some of them today.
Okay. Well, certainly the first factor I address, and the first one that was very clear from the research, is changes in education. American education has changed in some fundamental ways over the past 30 years. And one is that school has become unfriendly to boys. Boys doing things that boys have always done, pointing fingers at each other, saying, bang, bang, you're dead, throwing snowballs, drawing a picture of a weapon, things that boys have always done now can get you in a lot of trouble, can get you suspended from school. And I visited a high school and I spoke to the parents, and the parents were telling me how their son wrote a story. The assignment was to write a story about anything you want, and the boy wrote a story about the Battle of Stalingrad, winter 1942, from the perspective of a Russian soldier, and he's ambushed by a German soldier and fires his rifle at point-blank range, and the German soldier is trying to stab him with a knife. And then describes what happens when you fire your rifle at a man at point-blank range. The head explodes. A piece of eyeball goes one way, a piece of chin goes another way. This boy was suspended from school and would not be allowed to return until the parents had obtained an evaluation by a licensed professional. When the parents shared that story with me, it really struck a chord with me, because I wrote a very similar story for an assignment when I was a high school senior. And I got an award. When my mom died in September 2008, I went through her papers. I found she had kept the certificate, giving me the highest honor in creative writing for writing a violent story. Boys have always written about traumatic amputation and violent death.
And this isn't an isolated
and in 1977,
event.
it could get you an award, as it did for me. Now it gets you kicked out of school.
And the difference is astounding, because it's not an isolated event. I am hearing from parents across the nation for years now where their kid dares to write a story about a captain on a ship, a pirate chopping off the head of another person, and that kid's expelled, sent to the principal's office, experienced suspension. So what's going on here? What's the problem with this today?
Well, some people, Christina Hoff Sommers wrote a book called The War Against Boys, where she and I are talking about the same thing, the fact that boys are doing much less well than boys did a generation ago. And she blames that on Hillary Clinton. She says it's a left-wing conspiracy led by Hillary Clinton. and with all due respect with Christina Hoff Sommers, I think she's mistaken. This is not a conspiracy by left-wing extremists. It's good people, for the most part, who have reasonable motivations. They're worried about Columbine. They'll say, I'm concerned about school violence. I don't want to condone violence. So we're going to have a zero tolerance policy for violence. And I understand the motivation for that, but it's not informed. It's not evidence-based. And we now have very good evidence that when you put such policies in place, you accomplish nothing good. You do not in any case decrease actual school violence. When you say to boys, you're not allowed to draw a picture of a weapon, you're not allowed to write a story where anybody gets killed, no violence allowed in anybody's stories, you don't get boys who want to sit around writing stories about how they might feel if they weren't invited to the party. You get a growing proportion of boys who say, school sucks. I'm going to go home and play Grand Theft Auto where I get rewarded for killing people. And that's exactly what happened. Boys are voting with their feet. And to the extent that doing well and working hard to get a good mark in school is now seen by many boys as unmasculine.
It's feminine.
I mean, imagine a boy taking a Spanish test. If he gets a score of 100 on a test, is he going to let anyone else know? He's going to keep that secret because it's almost a badge of shame now to do really well in school.
Right.
People are going to think you're a nerd. Whereas if you complete all the missions in RDR2 or one of the other popular video games, you absolutely will get you will want the other boys to know that. That will raise your status in the eyes of the other boys.
And this also brings up the attitude that many young men and little boys now have of indifference. This idea that, well, if I just don't care about something, if I'm indifferent, that's manly.
Yeah, I don't know if they put it in quite so many ways, but to care, and I don't agree with you in general. It's fine to be passionate about video games. It's fine to be passionate about sports. It's just not okay to care about school, is what you find in the United States today.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked about the problem of schools, and we're going to dive into some solutions a little later. Everything from zero tolerance policy to the stifling of storytelling and art that includes anything that could have to do with violence. Let's talk about the next four as well, because they all tie into this issue of schools. You've already mentioned a little bit of video games, but how does this tie in?
I wouldn't agree that it ties into schools per se, but video games are another separate major factor. The video games have gotten so good. So let me tell you a story from my own practice. Mom gets upset one day. She finally confronts her son. She says, "What's the story here? You wake up late every day. You work a few hours a week at the coffee shop. You're 28 years old. You don't have a life." And she insisted he come see me. And I said, "So, tell me about yourself." He said, well, I'm level 85. You know what that means? I said, "Yeah, I think it's a reference to World of Warcraft. You've reached level 85 in World of Warcraft." He says, "It means I'm the best there is. There is no level above level 85. This was a few years back. He said, "I'm guild master. You know what that means?" I said, "Yeah, it means you're master of a guild in World of Warcraft." He says, "It means there are people in Liverpool, England, in Singapore, in Johannesburg, South Africa, who basically bowed down to me because what I've accomplished." I said, "Okay, but in the real world, you're living in your parents' basement and you don't have a real job." And he said, "Okay, I hear what you're getting at. You think like accomplishment in the real world is more important than accomplishment in the virtual world." I said, "Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair statement of my position." It was not a productive session because he finds his meaning of life in the video game. The video games are so realistic and the physics are so good and it's so compelling. I mean, the companies have billions of dollars. It's really, really well done. And talking to parents sometimes, they don't get it because when they think about video games, they're thinking about Pong or Pac-Man, and they don't understand how video games can be so addictive. And I say, you got to watch a boy play Call of Duty or RDR2 and realize how real it is and how immersive it is. This boy is perfectly satisfied in his bedroom with his 55-inch flat screen and being guild master in World of Warcraft. And the fact that he's not accomplishing anything in the real world doesn't bother him at all. And increasingly, parents don't get it, that these boys are finding their meaning of life. And parents will say to their teenage son, he's playing games at 2 in the morning. They'll say, "You got to turn off the video game and prepare for your school." And the boy says, "I'm going to be the next ninja. I don't need to worry about school." Parent has no idea who he's talking about. He's talking about Ninja, also known as Tyler Blevins, who earns over $400,000 a month playing video games. People pay to watch him on Twitch. And the boys are like, "Hey, I could do that. That's what I'm going to be. I don't need to worry about the War of 1812. I'm going to be Ninja." And so I wrote an article for the New York Times titled, "But Mom, Video Games Are My Job." What are you supposed to say when your son says, I don't need to worry about school because I'm going to make $1 million playing video games?
Oh, I had a friend who
just
recently just said this, that they were going to, their kid said to me that he was working on starting his own YouTube channel. And this kid, you have to know, is 9 years old. And he was telling me, yeah, you need about 1,000 followers on YouTube to start to go to viral. And I'm going to have people watch me play video games and I'm going to start making money. I'm going to get monetized. And I'm looking at this 9-year-old kid. I'm like, you know more about monetizing on YouTube probably than I do. And yet he's going to do it through playing video games. And it was sad that was his passion, was to do this with video games. And so I think the question, I want to throw it out now because many people are listening, their kids play video games. Parents will say, well, at least I know where my kid's at. My kid's at home. My kid's safe. We talk about video games a lot here on Trending and Concerns. What is your response when someone says, so do I just get rid of them? Do I moderate them? What do I do about video games?
You limit, govern, and guide your kids' use of video games. And in the book, Boys Adrift, I lay out those guidelines. They're very concrete, no more than 40 minutes a night on school nights, no more than an hour a day on weekends, and your minutes do not roll over. So if you go 3 weeks without playing, that doesn't mean you're allowed to spend 7 hours binging on a Saturday. Again, I've got 400 plus citations in the book. There's a lot of research. People have done a lot of research on the effects that video games have. And you need to empower parents to understand what's going on here and to be articulate. And what's the bottom line? The bottom line is Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. Above everything else, guard your heart, because everything you do flows from it. If you spend your free time reading, you'll become a better reader. You spend your free time playing a musical instrument, you'll be a better musician. Spend your free time shooting baskets, you'll become a better basketball player. You spend your free time playing video games, you will become a better gamer, but at a cost. And in the book, I show that kids who are spending all these hours a week playing video games undermine their social skills. They become less able to interpret facial expressions, less able to understand tone of voice. They're becoming less human. They're becoming video game accessories.
This is so important that as parents, we listen to this. I worked for a number of years in college campuses, and I saw firsthand college students who were literally not getting up to use the restroom, not going to the bathroom, had zero hygiene. And why? They were playing video games, skipping classes, knowing that it was on their dime and expensive money. And literally, it was known that that kid is a gamer because he smells bad. And I'm not trying to be mean, but it was considered almost a loser at times because that's how far it can go. Now, not everyone is on that level playing video games. I mean, your average dad and parent is playing video games probably more than he should today, but we have to understand the reality of how it's creating a lot of confusion about reality, non-reality, our pleasure reward system, and that's so important.
You mentioned college.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I've talked to college deans who are telling me their big concern is trying to get the men out of the dorm. You know, in ancient times, 30 years ago, men wanted to interact with young women, but now they'll have a dance and the men don't show up because they're in their dorm playing their video games. And so at Baylor, for example, in Texas, the ratio of women to men on campus is 60-40, which is pretty typical nationwide in the United States. But when you talk to the women, they'll say half those men never leave their dorm room.
Yes.
So that the actual ratio at any event you're at is 3-to-1, 4-to-1 women to men, because most of the men are staying back in their dorm playing their video game.
That's really important what you just said, because although there are still men going to college, once they get to college, they don't come out of their rooms to both socialize and attend classes.
Yeah, Meg Meeker has a wonderful story that I shared with her permission and her son's permission in my book, The Collapse of Parenting. So Dr. Meeker, of course, knows all this research very well. And she said to her son at age 12, "You're not playing video games, period." Mm-hmm. And he said, "You are crazy. There's no other mom in the state of Michigan who doesn't permit their son to play video games." She said, "Too bad. You're not playing video games at all." So he go and she doesn't relent. And years pass, and he gets a job. He's working. He's 16. He's earning money. Finally, he turns 18. He says, "I got my own money. I'm 18. I'm going to go out and buy an Xbox and a bunch of video games." And she said, "Okay." So he goes out and buys an Xbox and all these video games and goes off to college. And then in May, at the end of his first year of college, he calls mom and says, "Hey, Mom, guess what? I just got $400. Guess how I got it?" She says, "I have no idea." He says, "I sold my Xbox and all my video games." He said, "Mom, you wouldn't believe there's all these guys at college who expect you to be really impressed that they can kill 12 aliens in 10 seconds on Halo." And I'm like, "Dude, you can't talk to girls. You have no idea how to..."
It's so interesting because that's the reality, that a lot of these guys have no idea how to talk to women, how to have a conversation. And again, they don't even have basic life skills that they should have or already know or be learning while in college to start to care for themselves. And that's why we love to partner with, and when we talk to people such as Melanie Hempy at screenstrong.com, because those are the guidelines that we need to help say, well, maybe it's a hard no on video games. And Melanie Hemp is one person who advocates for no on video games. And you also have this balanced approach that Dr. Leonard Sax has in his book, Boys Adrift, of, okay, if you're going to have it, you have to limit it. And as he said, limit, govern, and guide. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Dr. Leonard Sax is with me. We're going to come back, continuing to discuss his book, incredible book, Boys Adrift, what's happening to our young boys and young men that's leading them to underperform. It's our weekly gentleman's hour today. What are you afraid of, men? Some, it may be failure. Others, such as Indiana Jones, it was snakes. We're also going to discuss how to indulge in alcohol as a gentleman. Today's show is sponsored by Kolbe Academy. With more than 40 years of experience in Catholic home education, Kolbe Academy offers a blend of classical Catholic curriculum and the latest educational technology. More info at relevantradio.com/Kolbe.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. It is great to be with you. It is our weekly marriage hour today on Trending, and we're going to dive into the topic of what are you afraid of as a man. I'd love to hear from you. You know, you can share what you other men, maybe it's spiders, maybe it's sharks like me. Did you hear about that shark attack in Australia? I'll share a little bit about it in a little bit. A fun fact I will share with you if you stay tuned. But also we're going to talk about indulging in alcohol as a gentleman. What does that look like? A lot of people really do struggle with finding the balance and moderation of it. So we'll discuss that here on Trending to kind of have some guiding principles to help you appreciate alcohol perhaps more than you have when you thought you were appreciating it but getting drunk. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. With me today has been Dr. Leonard Sax. He is a family practice medical doctor as well as holding a PhD in psychology, especially focusing on research. We're discussing his work, Boys Adrift, looking at the crisis, really the epidemic in our culture of boys and young men and their underperforming. He identifies 5 leading factors of this underperformance. Schools, we're discussing video games. We talked about some resources for that. And now we're going to dive into the next major crisis that many boys are facing, and that is ADHD. Dr. Sax, share with us a little bit more about what's happening here.
So, American boys are overdiagnosed. A boy in the United States is 14 times as likely to be diagnosed and treated with ADHD compared to a boy in the United Kingdom. And you look outside, actually the United Kingdom is kind of an outlier compared to other European countries. I wrote a book with a French publisher about Boys Adrift, the French version, using French data, Pourquoi les garçons perdent pied. And I learned that in all of France, there's fewer than 6,000 kids on medication for ADHD. I just spoke to school counselors in North Dakota. There's more boys in North Dakota on medication for ADHD than there are in all of France.
Wow.
It's overdiagnosed and overtreated. And one reason is that doctors in this country are not aware of the dangers associated with these medications. We now have many, many studies showing that the most popular medications, Adderall, Vyvanse, Concerta, Metadate, damage the motivational center of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. And I've spoken on this topic in Germany and Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand. You'll find doctors there are well aware of this research, but in this country they are not. And it's so easy to misdiagnose. So Jason's doing really badly in school, and he's just off the chart on the Connor scale, not paying attention in any class. So the doctor says, well, let's try Adderall. Let's try Vyvanse, see if it helps. And he starts Adderall Monday morning, and Monday afternoon the teacher calls up and says, wow, what an improvement. I had no idea your son was so bright, so clever. And he is. He's doing much, much, much better. But then he gets side effects, jittery, palpitations, loss of appetite, insomnia. So mom brings him in to see me, and I do a careful sleep history. I say, well, how much sleep do you get at night? And the parents say, well, he's in bed by 9. He's in his bedroom by 9. We wake him at 6. That's 9 hours. That's plenty, right? And I say, well, Jason, do you have a video game console in your bedroom? Of course. Were you playing last night? Yeah. What were you playing? Oh, Medal of Honor, like 132. He's getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. He needs 9. He is sleep deprived. Sleep deprivation perfectly mimics ADHD of the inattentive variety. There's no Connor scale. There's no Vanderbilt questionnaire that can distinguish whether you're not paying attention because you're sleep deprived versus not paying attention because you truly have ADHD. What's Adderall? What's Vyvanse? They're amphetamines. They're speed. They compensate for the sleep deprivation. But the appropriate remedy for sleep deprivation is sleep, not Schedule II amphetamines. So I said to the parents, you got to get the video game console out of the bedroom. You got to ensure that there are no screens in the bedroom and he's getting to sleep. And within 2 weeks, he's doing fine off medication.
This is a really important example because we've discussed this many times with Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman here on Trending, that a leading global epidemic today is sleep deprivation. It's a leading cause of everything from traffic deaths to suicide. And so this link you just made to the so-called diagnosis of ADHD is extremely significant for people to understand. It's sleep. And Dr. Sax, it's so upsetting for me because I have known firsthand many of my friends, even in college. I mean, if you wanted to get Adderall at any given time, it was easy because so many people are on it because they were diagnosed with ADHD years ago. And the reality is I saw so many friends, especially male friends, lose motivation and no one talks about the fact that Adderall, along with many of these medications, do lead you to suicidality as well, that this is a major problem in our culture, leading to why many young men and boys are floundering today.
That's right.
Let's list those other two challenges in our culture today that you identify as the leading causes of many of our boys who are adrift today. Those are endocrine disruptors, as well as the need for and lack of role models. Endocrine disruptors is going to be a bit of a surprise for many people. Can you share a little bit more?
Sure. So when researchers have looked at testosterone levels, they find that a young man today, a 20-year-old man today, has a testosterone level that's about half what a young man's testosterone level was 50 years ago. When you look at a young man's sperm count today, you find that it's less than half. Sperm counts and testosterone levels have dropped dramatically over the last 50 years, and there's no taper in that trend line. It continues dropping. And what's going on here? What's going on is that the modern world pumps out all these chemicals in food, in beverages, in cosmetics, plastics. When you microwave food in a plastic container, some of that plastic leaches into the food, and those contaminants act in the body like female hormones. And that's not good for anybody, but it's especially harmful for boys and men because it turns out that men depend on testosterone for motivation. It's not true for women, and we know this. Again, I present the studies. Highly motivated women don't have higher testosterone levels than less motivated women, but men do. Men rely on testosterone for motivation, and when testosterone levels drop, motivation drops. And that's why there's very simple rules I present in the book. Don't buy water in a plastic bottle. Polyethylene terephthalate leaches diethylhethyl phthalate into the water. That's a fancy way of saying that when you drink bottled water out of a plastic bottle, you are consuming small amounts of female hormones, and that's harmful. And you want to carry water around with you? Great, I do. I pour tap water into a steel canteen. That's what you want to do. Don't ever microwave anything in plastic. It doesn't cost anything. It's actually cheaper to pour tap water into a steel canteen than it is to buy bottled water. Right. It doesn't cost anything to follow these rules. It's easy, but again, parents are not aware of these concerns and how much it matters.
These are key guidelines that we must implement in our life. We have a specialist on fertility that comes on all the time, and these are the same things that are impacting women's hormones and our capacity as women to have children, the fact that there's a rise in polycystic ovarian syndrome, Hashimoto's, endometriosis, but this is the other side of it. How are these same hormones leading to infertility in women, leading, yes, to infertility in men? I mean, we've seen, again, as you mentioned, we just talked about this last week, men's sperm count has halved in the last 40, 50 years. And so, but it's also leading to the lack of what we might even argue is a male boldness. We know with many people today, Dr. Sax, who are taking cross-sex hormones, that when a female, because we have this transgender craze where many young girls in teenage adolescence are choosing to go on to cross-sex hormones, taking testosterone, one of the benefits that they love is they're a little more bold because testosterone helps you to feel that way. Yet on the opposite end, men are having less and less of this, which is making them to really struggle in their male identity. And they're even wondering, why aren't I that, quote, macho man, or why don't I feel manly? Part of it is simply a hormonal imbalance. Talking about this, Dr. Sax, we actually have a question coming in. And if you're just joining us, that's Dr. Leonard Sax. He's a family physician as well as a researcher. He holds a PhD in psychology. You can find him at leonardsax.com. That's leonardsax.com. We'll include a link on social media as well as in the podcast notes for today's show. Please listen, subscribe, and share this episode with many parents and maybe even adults who need to hear this. In fact, calling now from San Benito, Texas is Jose. Jose, you have a question for Dr. Sax. What's your question?
Dr. Sax, I find myself to be a man-child. I don't know if you're familiar with the term. I've been trying to change, but I find it to be quite difficult at times. I'm not at the level where I cannot talk to others. I enjoy talking to others, but still I feel that I let my insecurities, get the best of me. What can I do?
Well, I'd really need to sit down and meet with you, but I would encourage you. I hope you'll take a look at the book. Most libraries have a copy. The book is Boys Adrift, because there's not just one thing you need to do. There may be a number of things you need to do. And certainly I advise young men to put away the video games, to engage the real world, to find a good role model, find a mentor, find a real man that you can look up to, even if it's only once a month, to connect with. Of course, we talked about the endocrine disruptors. There's a wonderful and very funny book called Slow Death by Rubber Duck about how these endocrine disruptors are messing with our bodies. But the good news in that book is these two authors decided they were going to be really good and not consume anything plastic or artificial. And in 1 month's time, their levels normalized. So the good news is you can heal, you can get better, you can fulfill your potential.
And this may sound so random, but kind of on a side note, even receipts, our receipts have a tremendous amount of plastic in them. And I was actually told by my physician, because I have a lot of things surrounding endocrine disruption, to not touch receipts, to try not to take these receipts all the time.
Thermal paper. You want to stay away from that. And when I fill up at the gas station, I never let it print out a receipt because I'm not going to touch it.
Yes. Excellent, excellent. Okay, and I want to thank Jose from San Benito for calling, because that's a lot to say outright, hey, I'm a man-child. I prefer video games. That means you want to change. And I'm grateful for you calling, for sharing this, because there are a lot of people who are in your same boat, but maybe don't have the courage to call right now, not maybe necessarily are asking what are the next steps. So please check out that book, Boys Adrift. We're including links in the show notes, and leonardsax.com is an incredible resource. I want to come to number 5, and you just mentioned it, in those causes for why so many boys and young men are adrift, and that has to do with role models. Please explain.
Yeah. So when you look at American culture, 50 years ago, if you said to a boy, be a man, he knew what that meant, because the popular culture was full of role models, whether it's Gary Cooper or Paul Newman or Sidney Poitier, who were competent, responsible, caring. That's gone. This past September, Drake released his new album, Certified Lover Boy, broke every record, took 9 of the top 10 spots on the Billboard Top 100, which the Beatles never did. And it is filth. There's no other word to describe it. It is obscene. He's saying, my ball is bigger than yours, and that's just me being modest. If you say to a young man today, be a man, he doesn't know what that means. Boys are not born knowing what it means to be gentlemen. They have to be taught, and we no longer teach them. Instead, they're immersed in the culture of Drake, Bruno Mars, Eminem, and obscenity and filth is what's being held up as models of successful manhood. How is a boy to know if he's received no instruction? I mentioned a rape case in Steubenville, Ohio, where 2 high school boys raped a girl who was drunk and unconscious, and other kids were videoing this. And Mike DeWine, who prosecuted that case, said what really struck him was that the boys didn't understand that they had done something wrong. They would say, well, she was unconscious. They have received no instruction. The popular culture of the United States is toxic, and you need to be on your guard, and you need to mindfully and thoughtfully create healthy role models, find healthy role models for your son to get an understanding of what a man can be and what a man should be.
Dr. Sax, in your book, Boys Adrift, you mention how the Ford Foundation awarded a grant to 3 female scholars who went in and addressed what was essentially a boys-only school system occurring within an area in California. Can you share a little bit about that and how schools have really become a problem, and what those solutions can be if someone finds their son not performing well in school?
Yeah. So this was a public school that was using the all-boys format with male teachers to try and see if they could motivate boys in an all-boys setting. Because, again, in the United States right now, many boys define masculinity negatively. In other words, being a real man means not doing whatever it is the girls are doing. If girls are trying hard to get a good mark, then I don't. If girls are turning into homework, then I won't. You mentioned earlier about how boys don't seem to care about school, and they don't, because the girls care, so it's not cool for boys to care. So again, this school thought, hey, maybe if we have an all-boys setting led by men, we can motivate boys. And so one of the male teachers was talking to the boys about what it means to be a man, and it means that you make sure your family is fed, and if you only have 2 hamburgers and you've got a wife and child, then they get to eat the hamburgers and you don't. It's a very simple example, but he's talking to elementary school kids, if I recall correctly. And the 3 women observing this just thought this was the worst thing ever, that he's reinforcing stereotypes. And they're tearing him down, but they have nothing to offer in its place. If you don't like the stereotype of the father who sacrifices for his family, what are you putting in its place? They got nothing. And that's what really troubles me, is that we've got all these folks on the political left who want to tear down these traditional roles, but they offer nothing in its place. I also wrote an essay about that. This woman, columnist, was very upset. Columnist for the New York Times was upset that her son's teacher used the term ladies and gentlemen, which she just thought was so old-fashioned and inappropriate and reinforced harmful stereotypes. She felt that teachers should just use the word citizens and not use the term ladies and gentlemen. What happens when you don't teach kids to be ladies and gentlemen? Do you get virtuous citizens? No. What you end up with is girls posting selfies half-dressed on Instagram and boys playing video games where they pretend to kill people. If you ignore gender differences, you end up reinforcing the worst aspects of gender. If you don't teach girls and boys to be ladies and gentlemen, you end up with what we have right now, which is a country where girls are frantic because they don't think they're sexy enough on TikTok, and boys who are spending their free time looking at pornography and playing violent video games.
It's astounding we've reached a point in a culture where the American Psychological Association has called masculinity toxic, but the problem has been that we've erased, as you're discussing, the differences between men and women, and creating this neutrality, this numbness that we've seen has damaged and led to the crisis of what is truly at times toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. And it's become this massive confusion. And this is why your work is so important, Dr. Sax, finding resources and identifying the problem of why these boys are going to drift. In just a few moments we have together, can you share what a good resource would be for parents who say, I don't know where to send my kid to school? What options do I have?
So in Boys Adrift, I talk about the characteristics of a boy-friendly school and how it's different from a school that is unfriendly to boys. I have visited now over 460 schools over the last 21 years, and I can tell you that the majority of public schools in the United States today are not friendly to boys. I think that's
Agreed.
I can defend that statement at great length. And 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have said to parents, talk to the principal, share this research with them, and see if they'll make a change. I don't say that anymore because we learned pretty darn quick that a parent or even a group of parents approaching a principal is just an annoyance. And they may say something nice, but they're not going to change anything. I've become very pessimistic from all my school visits. And my advice to parents is if you find that your son is getting disciplined for doing things that boys have always done, he chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a pistol and said bang, and he got a discipline referral. And this is a true story. A 7-year-old boy chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a pistol and was suspended from school. That's a school you need to leave, and you may need to move. If you can't find a boy-friendly school in your neighborhood, then you have to be willing to move. My wife and I moved from Maryland to Pennsylvania because we were unhappy with the choices of school available to us there, and your child has to be your top priority. So I had to switch jobs and sell our house and find a new job, and it was the right call.
Good man. Thank you for sharing that, your own testimony, as well as your incredible work as a physician and as a researcher in psychology in the crisis today surrounding femininity, masculinity. Please find his work at leonardsax.com, leonardsax.com. We'll include links in the podcast notes at relevantradio.com. And please share this episode with someone who needs it, wondering what's going on with their young adult son or their kid, maybe at risk for being put on ADHD medication when they're not ADHD, overplaying video games, needing role models, school crisis. There are true resources in his work, Boys Adrift. I highly recommend it. So please go check out his work. Again, links in the podcast notes. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Sax. It is our weekly Gentleman's Hour today on Trending. We're going to come back talking about what men fear and how to indulge in alcohol as a gentleman. This hour is sponsored by Solidarity Health Share. Prices start at $384 a month for families. Call now to see how much you can save. 855-954-5688.
bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Welcome to our weekly Gentleman's Hour. If you didn't hear our conversation with Dr. Leonard Sax, please go subscribe to the podcast, relevantradio.com, or wherever you catch your podcast. You're wondering why young boys and young men are adrift today, lacking motivation, struggling with ADHD. Well, we get to the bottom of it. 5 causes and solutions, all discussed here on Trending. I want to come to the topic of indulging in alcohol as a gentleman now. How do you do it? Can you? Do you think it's even possible? I was listening, or actually reading, an article this week from CatholicGentleman.com by Michael Foley, and he ends this article about drinking alcohol as a gentleman, as a person of faith, and he says the question is not whether Christians should drink festively, but it's a question of whether they will be the only ones left capable of doing so. The crisis today surrounding alcohol is we kind of have this split attitude and distinction even within Christianity. Denominations outright puritanically rule it out as evil, innately bad. And then there's the Catholic approach where you know someone's a Catholic when they are A-okay with drinking often. I mean, that's the joke, at least in the Protestant circles that I've been in growing up, that you always know when the Catholic arrives because they bring the alcohol. But how do you find the balance? The culture sees nothing wrong with drunkenness today, and yet we're called as Christians, as Catholics, as people of faith, to do all things in moderation. I was talking to our new producer here on Trending, John Hanratty. By the way, shout out to our new team member. And he was talking about how moderation means not using alcohol as a vehicle for fun. It is a tool for fellowship and cooperative merriment. It's a catalyst, not the engine. I think that's a really, really important statement, that our use of alcohol is not a vehicle for fun, and it's meant for fellowship and for merriment, for enjoyment. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And he said it's a catalyst, not the engine. These are profound words because it's a reminder for us that everything we use as people of faith are meant to be tools. Things we use are tools. Our phones are tools. Alcohol, it's a tool. And it's a gift. So let's break down from this excellent article at CatholicGentleman.com a little bit, I think, of a stronger perspective to help us if maybe you struggle a little bit with your philosophy on alcohol. But let's be real. I think there are a lot of things in life that we don't really have a philosophy or an approach or a take on, but we should. I think many people just fall into getting drunk, not meaning to, but they just fall into it because they don't have a plan. They don't have an intention. They're not intentional with how they approach alcohol. And so here are some, I think, guiding tips to have that better approach. How can you indulge in alcohol as a gentleman? So some of the tips given in this fantastic article by Michael Foley, I'd like to walk through. Number 1, he mentions in moderation. Obviously, we're going to say that, requiring virtue. And the reality is when you have moderation when it comes to alcohol, not only are you more pleasant for other people to enjoy you, but you actually enjoy it more too. You don't have to get drunk to enjoy alcohol. You don't have to get drunk in order to take off a little bit of the edge and loosen up in a social environment. And that's, I think, what's important is moderation is necessary for actually fostering real friendship and engagement with others. And that's what's important. When we're using alcohol, we have to do it in moderation in order for it to actually achieve what we want it to achieve. Unless, of course, unless you're trying intentionally to drink to forget, but shouldn't we be drinking to remember to enjoy? So the second thing is to drink with gratitude. This is the second topic listed. And I think this is a really, really good reminder that if we want to enjoy something, Remember the word enjoy. Joy essentially means to live in God's grace, that it's a life of grace. We have grace flowing in us. So in order to enjoy something, to be in God's grace, well, we have to recognize it's a grace. And so to drink with gratitude means that we're being good stewards of what we've received. To be good stewards of not just ourselves, but the gifts and things of this earth and even of the work of men. It's funny because modern philosophy, we have philosophers such as Kant who have this approach to gratitude, that gratitude is something bad because it leads to an idea of dependence, but also of owing a debt to someone. And in modern philosophy, our modern ideology today is absolute independence, that I'm self-sufficient and independent and I don't rely on anyone or anything to make me, or that I have to, go back and make up for something. This is why a lot of people are cutting off their parents, because they want that radical independence that is so detached that they can just make a name for themselves. It's really a modern version of the Tower of Babel. We're trying to build ourselves up. But if we have that approach of gratitude, it really changes the game of actually being able to enjoy alcohol. The third way to indulge in alcohol as a gentleman is with your memory. That is, I'll say with your memory intact and being able to remember things. Again, I mentioned earlier, some people drink to remember, other people drink to forget. I hope we are in the former. That is, that we're not trying to celebrate losing ourselves. I'll never forget, some years ago, I went to a wedding and I ended up meeting a family member's future spouse there. Now, a year later, everyone's getting married, everyone's celebrating, and I get to see my family member's spouse again. And, we're talking, and many of us had the same experience where over and over again, as we're going around, we're saying, "Oh, it's so good to see you again." And she's saying, "Oh, it's so nice to meet you." Well, why was she saying it's so nice to meet you? Because she had overindulged at the wedding. The next day was totally hungover, sick as could be. And although we had some great conversations, she didn't remember. She didn't remember the time we had together. And so I bring this up because sometimes in the midst of trying to enjoy something, in the midst of having fun and enjoying, we can go too far, lose ourselves, lose the memories of the good times we had with others, the memory of ourselves in that context. And yet that's the challenge. And when it comes to alcohol and engaging in a gentlemanly way and indulging, that we're indulging but with moderation, with enjoyment, with memory. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. It's been a great gentleman's hour here on Trending. I'll be back tomorrow for our weekly marriage hour. This is Timmerie from Trending with Timmerie. Joining me Thursday is one of the world's foremost addiction experts, Dr. Nicholas Carderas, author of the book Glow Kids, How Screen Addiction is Hijacking Our Kids. We'll get his thoughts on the metaverse and how to approach this new digital world. Thursday is also our marriage hour. We'll discuss how to save a marriage the right way before it's too late. So join me Thursday at 6 p.m. Central on Relevant Radio or the Relevant Radio app.